Welcome everyone to the Change Starts Here podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Odham. And on today's episode, we have an incredibly talented author and professor, Chip Heath. Dr. Chip Heath is just an amazing, thoughtful individual he's a world-renowned author, best-selling author. Him and his brother have written 4 life-changing books. One of them is called Made to Stick. Another one is Switch. Another one is Divisive. And the most recent one with his brother Dan was The Power of Moments. For me, his book Switch that I read probably 10 or more years ago was really pivotal in my life of helping me break some of my poor habits, as well as helping lead change in my life, as well as organization I was working with. And so if you're someone who's kind of felt like you're stuck in a rut, or someone, we talked this to Chip about it a little bit, but if you're someone who has struggled with just seeing the gaps and the flaws versus the bright spots, as Chip refers into them, this is a great conversation for you to dive into. We spend most of today's episode diving into his latest book called Making Numbers Count. And while it is math focused, because he's talking about numbers, it is so enlightening for whether you like math, whether you like numbers or not. One of the things that I appreciate that he talks about is for the longest time, there were many places where there wasn't a number really to think about above 5, but anything above 5 was lots, which is crazy to try to comprehend. So he breaks down ways for us to help be more engaged in numbers, to help learn numbers better, but also to make them more meaningful and relevant to our lives. So that's a really cool part of the conversation. We start off diving in on his journey, to start as a graduate of Texas A&M University in industrial engineering, to work his way up to a Ph.D. in psychology. That seems interesting to me. And then now that he's a professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business and a world-renowned author, it's a really cool life journey. So we dive into those parts. We also talk about, when he's had ruts in his life, like we all can have, what are some of those strategies he's had in his life to help him break out of that? And then lastly, as we're interested in all of our guests, like how are they successful, how they created meaningful change in their life, we dive into what have been those keys for him. And when I asked him the question about what habit or discipline he has that's helped him be successful, he has a really unique answer. And it's something that I would just encourage you to stay tuned in on, because I was fascinated by his take on that, just the paradigm of it, as well as his specific answer. So Chip, Dr. Heath, he wants me to call him Chip, which I can't think of enough for, is very down to earth, so smart and thoughtful. And so this is just one of those kind of fireside chat conversations where I felt like I got smarter and was taking my own personal notes as I was going through the conversation. So I'm confident you will enjoy it, whether you like numbers or not. It's a really interesting conversation, and Chip Heath is an amazingly talented and thoughtful individual. So thank you. Enjoy this conversation. It is great. Again, if you have not hit the subscribe button, please subscribe, and however you listen to it, your loyal listenership is incredibly important to us. I'm so thankful for it. So enjoy. Chip, Mr. Heath, I don't know, Dr. Heath, what can I call you? You're doctor.
Chip is great.
Okay. You're very disarming. And so I can't believe I get to call you Chip. So Chip, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
So the first question, before we start, I think I'm supposed to say howdy. Is that correct? Howdy. So my nephew, Jack Reed, is a junior, I think by hours at Texas A&M, and he is a proud Aggie, and it's pretty awesome to see him just flourish there and see the community there. And so I've been told that I just need to start by saying howdy. So it's good to have you.
You're a good Texan now.
Yeah. Well, I went to SMU in Dallas, Texas.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a different kind of Texan.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So with that, our first question we ask everybody, Chip, is who are you and what do you love about what you do?
I'm a professor at Stanford University. I teach in the business school. And what I love about what I do is I get to talk to people about ideas that they're interested in using to transform the world. And the way that most of them do it is by forming an organization of some kind. It could be a nonprofit, but it could be a business. And I love the process of helping somebody take an idea that's in their mind, but they haven't really articulated it to others, and helping them get that out into the world in a way that persuades others and brings resources to bear on their idea and helps them gain momentum.
So I feel like there's a number of folks who would say a similar passion would be like, I just want to help people improve their lives in the world. But you've done it honestly in so many different ways. And one of the questions I have is, to start with the howdy at Texas A&M, I think you studied industrial engineering in college.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, when you were leaving college, was that answer on your heart? Were you thinking, how do I change the world for people and organizations? And if not, what were you thinking you would do with your life at that point?
Well, I thought I wanted to teach. And so somewhere around my junior year at Texas A&M University, I decided I wanted to be a teacher. And first I thought I wanted to be a high school teacher. And I looked into it, and it turns out with the credentialing and the courses that you have to take, it would have taken me another 3 years to come up with my teaching credential for high school in the state of Texas. And I looked at it and said, well, 3 years for that, 4 years for a PhD, I think I may go with the PhD. And so that's where I took off and went to Stanford, got my PhD in psychology, did a lot of work with economics. And so it was part of the crowd that was thinking about the issues that became known as behavioral economics. And now has generated 2 Nobel Prizes for people in our field.
Wow.
And that was a very, very meaningful shift for me between doing the teaching for high school and doing teaching at the college and university level, because I'm persuaded that I had great teachers as a high school student and junior high school student, and I'm not sure I appreciated what they were doing as much as I should have.
We've actually talked to a few folks about kind of our maturation as learners and as people, and so many of the guests we've had, whether it's been on camera or off camera, have talked similarly about how could I have really cherished my teachers earlier in my career, particularly in high school. What drove you, from an outsider's perspective, it looks like you go from industrial engineering to studying psychology. What drove that passion and focus to go after a PhD in psychology versus anything else?
Yeah, I initially thought about teaching engineering, and that was kind of boring. And then I thought about social sciences. I looked at history and took some advanced history classes in other areas, and that was appealing. But economics captured my interest in a serious way because it was systematic, like engineering was. In fact, I learned more about analysis, I think, more about calculus and how calculus works to help generate predictions in my economic class than I ever did in any of my engineering classes. But the thing that struck me the most was I stumbled across this kind of psychology called cognitive psychology. And there was an autobiography by one of the founders of the field, Jerome Bruner, and I read it and I was just riveted. It's all the things that I'd always been thinking about, because cognitive psychology is about thinking and learning and memory and decision making, and how do we put all these things together in our mind. And that was just so exciting to me. And I'd always thought of psychology as kind of Dear Abby, who was the Vice columnist of the time, and Freud, and I wasn't in love with either of the endpoints of that continuum, but the cognitive psychology was like coming home. And so I did an undergraduate thesis in cognitive psychology and applied to graduate schools, and was lucky enough to get into Stanford.
I mean, lucky enough, yes, that's a life-changing place. I mean, so as a professor, you go to, you get your PhD, you want to become a professor, I assume. And, you've taught at some of the schools that I've, was considered going to earlier in my career, that are world-class organization, University of Chicago, I believe. I think you taught at Fuqua, at Duke, now, at GSB at Stanford, which is, again, a thought leader for the world. There's many people, again, who would be satisfied at doing those things and making that their impact. But you decided to become an author. Can I ask, what was that impetus? How did you decide, I'm gonna write my first book?
Yeah, it was actually our editor that acquired the project for our publisher the first time around. It was Ben Lennon, and so I had been teaching a course at Stanford on the marketplace of ideas. And one of the things that frustrated me about the world was that we have things like urban legends and rumors that propagate from person to person kind of instantaneously and automatically. And yet we can't get across public health messages in a way that gets junior high kids not to pick up smoking. And so I was fascinated by those issues, and I had done a talk for a Silicon Valley group. It was a breakfast, and the theme was what we can learn from urban legends about messaging. And my editor, Ben Lennon, saw the account of that talk and wrote me a letter and said, I think this could be a book. And so I had in my mind that it'd be interesting to write a book about this sometime, but I don't think I would have done it at that time without that. And I appealed to my brother, who is a great writer, to join me on the project and be a co-author. And that was the best decision I've ever made, because he's a great writer. I take no credit for the written words of our books, but in working with him on that, that's been one of the best family bonding experiences I can imagine.
Well, that was the second question, is that, I find, especially with writing, even like I go back to like when I was in school, just writing, a paper is a really vulnerable experience. Like you put it out there and your teacher is going to grade you. I mean, writing a book is just infinitely probably more of a vulnerable experience. So it sounds like usually I would want to do that by myself. You said, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to find my brother, who is incredibly talented as a writer. Was that scary going into it, or was that something that like it just makes sense because you have your strengths, he has his strengths, this will come together and be brilliant?
I think we had some skepticism. In fact, our mom had to do an intervention at one point, because I'm the kind of person that likes to get advanced on the material and nail it down. And so I would study all semester. And then the finals week, I would read a science fiction novel, because all I had to do is stay calm in between tests, because I'd prepared as much as I want to. Dan would start a paper major assignment at 2 a.m. after watching The Simpsons for a couple of hours, and he would nail it. He would get A+ on his assignments, but he was always a last minute kind of guy. And so Mom, at one point, we were doing things, and I was getting further ahead in outlining chapters that he was going to write, and so we were getting frustrated with each other. And Mom said, Dan has this pattern that he gets excited at 2 a.m. about the project, and he nails it. He nails it every time. And by the way, his grades are better than yours. And so, just relax and enjoy the fact that you've got a brother that's capable of doing this kind of stuff. And that changed the collaboration. It's just that realization that she had watching the two of us and our patterns was useful. And so we could label it and we could talk about it, as opposed to just get frustrated with each other.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the intro, I mean, that partnership has led to 4 best-selling books. I mean, there was Made to Stick, which you were kind of referencing there. Switch, as I told you, is one of the books that has changed my life. If you ask me for, a list of 5 to 10 books that have been the most influential, Switch has been that for me. So if folks are listening, haven't read that, I would encourage you to think about it. Decisive and The Power of Moments, which has been really impactful lately, as you see on social media and other places. It's been a great recipe for success. And now you've written a book that I'm a former high school math teacher, so I'm actually pretty excited about the title. Your latest book is Making Numbers Count, and you co-authored with Carla Starr. I'm curious, just high level, what is this book about and who is it for?
So one of the things that Dan and I didn't tackle as much as we wanted to in writing a book on making ideas stick was the problem of numbers, because so many things in life are numerical. We have numbers in the news that are trillions and billions and millions and nanometers and microseconds and milliseconds, and so there are all these units in numbers that our brains are not really familiar with. And the question is, how do you get across meaning in those numbers, given that our brains aren't prepared for doing that? And so let me give you a quick example. If you talk about millions versus billions, those are terms that we hear all the time. We know that a billion is bigger than a million, but how much bigger is it?
Yep. Well,
if you're counting off 1 million seconds, it would take you 12 days to count off 1 million seconds. How many days would it take to do 1 billion seconds? Well, it would take 32 years. And that discrepancy, everybody that I've given that comparison to, and it doesn't matter whether they're a physicist or a mathematician or a high school math teacher, that hits you in the gut, because we didn't know at a visceral level how much bigger a billion was than a million until you translate it into a metric that we can understand.
Yep.
And so it turns out that people aren't very well prepared for mathematics in terms of our genetic equipment. So we're pretty good at numbers up to about 5. And so if you're reading a kid's book and you see a picture of 3 goldfish, your brain shouts at it, you that there's 3 there. And you don't have to count them. You just know that there are 3. And that's true for 4, and it's true for 5. But starting at 6 and 7, things get a little fuzzier. And so people aren't so good at recognizing 7. And past 10 or 12, we're just sunk. And it turns out also that of all the cultures in the world that have been documented, most cultures have names for numbers up to about 5. So uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco. Those are names in Spanish for number 5. And they go on past that, and we go on past that in English. But most of the small scale societies that have ever existed in the world, they get by with numbers from 1 to 5. And after 6, it's lots. So 6 is lots, and 7 is lots, and 100 million is lots. So you can imagine the difficulty of navigating in those cultures that don't have names for those numbers. It's like, honey, do we have enough eggs for dinner? Well, we got lots of eggs. We got lots of people coming over. We'll see how it goes. And so numbers are brilliant cultural innovation, and we have the advantage of that. Somebody doing that before us, and all we have to do is learn it. But it does highlight the fact that we're not prepared for numbers in the way that we should be. And so if we're going to get numbers across, we're going to have to go through a translation process to take an unnatural language of numbers, and translate it as if we were in a meeting. We wouldn't throw out a phrase in Japanese or Spanish without translating that phrase for everybody else. And so we had to translate our numbers in the same way.
So who is this book for then? Because when I'm listening, my paradigm first is, a couple ways. One, as a former teacher, I taught trigonometry, and to think, man, kids weren't even programmed to understand up to 5. I don't know, like that kind of rocks my brain of how would I change my teaching, understanding some of these concepts. And then as a dad of 3 young kids who are trying to learn math, that's where my head goes. But as you're writing this, who's the audience as you see it?
Yeah. And with most of our books, we start out with a kind of dual audience, at least. And so for this book, Carl and I were thinking about a high school science teacher or math teacher, and probably science teacher. And the other was an entrepreneur that was trying to pitch a business. And so you've got 2 people that are taking numbers that an audience is not familiar with, the high school kids that are in the science class, and the venture capitalists who might want to invest in the entrepreneur's idea, but they don't necessarily know the market or the speeds or the feed rates of the technology in that area. And the question is, how do you get that across in a way that is meaningful to people? And so for example, the high school science teacher, you talk about 4.5 light years between us and the nearest solar system.
Right.
And how do you convey that number? Well, one of the techniques for conveying numbers is to put people in a concrete situation where they can imagine a picture of the world. It would correspond to the situation they're talking about. So imagine if you could shrink the solar system down to the size of a quarter. And so the sun's in the middle of the quarter, and the planets are on the outskirts. And if you remember the space probe Pioneer, there's a satellite that we launched back in the 60s or 70s that has taken 40 years to get from Earth to exit the solar system. And so each quarter has about 40 radius times 2, 80 years of stuff in it. Right. And so you take the quarter and put it down at one end of the field, the soccer field. And you walk to the other end of the soccer field and you put down another quarter. That's 4.5 light years. And that's a mind-blowing exercise for me. And that sense of awe is one that Carl and I, as co-authors, continually found ourselves in awe of what the world had when you understand it through math. And if you could give that feeling to students, I think that would change the relationship that most of us have with math. So here's another simple example. Many species of frogs can jump many body lengths at a time. So these are not specially trained frogs. These are not NBA style professional frog jumpers, they're just regular frogs that jump in many body lengths. If you translate it into human terms, what would it be like if we could leap many body lengths? Well, some of the best NBA players can dunk from the free throw line. And no NBA player has ever dunked from the 3-point line. But if you're a frog, if you had the frog ability to jump multiple body lengths, you could dunk from the other team's 3-point line. And so all of a sudden, there's a thing that we wouldn't think about more than once, is just, well, a frog can jump a long way. But if you translate that into a different context, all of a sudden you get the sense of, wow, the world is a wonderful, wonderful place, and strange things happen in the world. And I think that sense of awe is a payoff of taking numbers seriously.
Well, I think, to your point, as a former math teacher, I was already excited about diving into the numbers, but when you make it, use a soccer field to describe, hey, this is how far this measurement is. And, for me, a former basketball player, the free throw line to the other side, there's a sense of awe and wonderment in my mind. I was like, oh, that's so fascinating. And so I go from learning to really trying to be a sponge and soak it in. And you might have touched on a few of them, but the ones that I kind of pulled out, which, some of the principles that you talked about are simple perspective cues, vividness, convert to a process, and emotional measuring sticks. Which ones, I'd like to understand which one is which to walk out of here. So simple perspective cues, which one was that? Was that the quarter?
No, simple perspective cues is even simpler than that, the quarter, because that's a fairly elaborate setup that I had to give for that. But simple perspective cues is just, if you looked up the area of Pakistan, the geographic area of Pakistan, it'd be 340,000 square miles.
Yep.
That doesn't help you much unless you're a geography person that's used to interpreting land areas of political units. But if you say that 340,000 square miles is the size of 2 Californias, that simple cue puts in perspective what you're learning. It puts it in terms that American at least can understand what's going on. The wildfires that struck Australia a few years back that burned so many square miles of territory, those were the size of 2 Portugals. Or if you're from the States, the size of Washington State, or the size of the New England states. Those are 3 different comparisons that could give you purchase on a particular notions, fact, statistic. And there's some very clever researchers at Bing and Microsoft that started giving people perspective cues when they would look up facts. And all of a sudden, recall rates and ability to recall and use data doubled with just one of those simple perspective cues. And 2 Californias is actually a pretty good perspective cue because it's a small number and it's a well-known object. But you could have done 5 Oklahomas, and you still get this doubling benefit of the cues. And so the first piece of advice is, when you're translating numbers, do something. It doesn't have to be the perfect thing. It doesn't have to be the perfect comparison, but whatever comparison you give people to put things in perspective and context, that's going to help, because otherwise numbers don't click onto our brains very well, and we're left with things floating around in the ether.
Yeah, I think that one, honestly, I would say, so I'm an avid reader of a weekly periodical, The Economist. And as much as I love it and geek out on it, journalists could absolutely use that tool. And every time they're driving numbers, just to have that beat into the understanding of every time I put a number, how do I put something simple that people can make it sticky for folks, right? Yeah. To create impact. That's incredibly helpful. The second one was vividness. And again, you may have hit on them. I'm just trying to understand each concept. So what is the vividness principle?
Vividness, in common usage, it means something that's very striking, or color or shiny bling kind of stuff. But what it means for us is just make it tangible and concrete and immediate for people. And so one of my favorite examples in the book is Carla was taking a science class in her junior high school years, and they were talking about the problem of polluted water and how much water do we actually have to drink in the world? Because the world is made of water. We could think pollution is not a big deal. But it turns out 97.7 97.5% of the water in the world is salinated. It's in oceans. And of the remaining 2.5%, 99% of that is tied up in ice, so frozen tundra or icebergs,
Yep.
and the polar ice caps. And so the remaining 0.0025%, we can drink all of that as long as we don't pollute it. And so those numbers give you a sense that there's not much water out there. But what the teacher did is go further and create a tangible, vivid image of that exercise. He said, imagine a gallon jug of milk, if you fill it up with salt water. And at the top, you float 3 ice cubes. And there are some drops of water that are streaming off those ice cubes. That's the amount of fresh water that we have in the world, is those few drops of water off the ice cubes at the top of the gallon jug of salt water.
Wow.
And Carla said that it made all the difference for her as a 7th grader in talking conversation at cocktail parties with adults that her family would have over, because all of a sudden she had interesting science information about a relevant topic that's relevant to discussion, and she took great pride in telling about that analogy. And so that's pretty good. It's a good day's work for a science teacher when you've got 7th graders interacting with adults on a scientific issue and feeling competent and like an expert. And that's the advantage of vivid information, is it sticks in our mind and we can work with it in a way that transforms how we approach the situation.
Well, I think to your point, I mean, yes, one, and most importantly, probably is like really retaining the information, but 2, just using that example, it provides urgency, right? Like I see myself thinking, man, that's all we have. And what, it just makes the problem very real, which is really powerful. All right. So 3rd one, I could geek out all day on this, convert to a process. What's that about?
Well, let me put you, because you mentioned emotion, and one of the follow-ups to what you just said is that because the vivid example, there's more emotion in that and more of a willingness to tackle something. And I think that's an important thought, is that numbers not only have to help us understand the situation, they have to help us understand why we care about that situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you're saying it motivates me to go out and do something about it, or to at least foster the conversation or contribute to people who are trying to deal with the problem, those are all motivational aspects of an emotional reaction to a number. And it's important to remember that our numbers have to provide motivation in many situations, and how to do that is an important problem. And so we'll get to your process in a second, but let me give you an example of an emotional case. Sepsis is a huge problem as a killer of people, especially in hospital settings. And most people know that heart attacks and strokes are big killers. Cancer is a big killer. Sepsis is right up there with those, and nobody's thought about it or heard about it very often. And so Kaiser Permanente in California came up with a procedure for reducing sepsis deaths that saved 55% of the people that wound up with sepsis. And what that would translate to, if every hospital in the country implemented it, is a savings of 149,000 people.
Wow.
Now that's a big number, and it seems pretty important. But putting that in perspective and borrowing the emotion from other domains, what that means is if you could implement this procedure at every hospital in America, you would save the same number of people as if you could save every woman with breast cancer and every man with prostate cancer. Now, by adding those 2 comparisons and putting them together, all of a sudden I think we've got more motivation, because everybody can understand the infrastructure. We've all been on breast cancer walks. We've worn blue ribbons and red ribbons, pink ribbons, and so we have an infrastructure and a way of thinking about the importance of issues like prostate cancer and breast cancer. If sepsis is more important than the combination of those things, that's something that we ought to pay attention to. And so I think in a lot of situations, to add emotion to our numbers, what we're doing is borrowing emotion from another area that is already well established in our minds and giving people the comparison. And so that's an important technique to keep in mind for emotional, when you need emotion, is borrow the emotion from a similar domain.
That's powerful. All right. So the 3rd one is convert to a process. We'll have one more after this.
Convert to a process is The observation is that in general, if we just add up things in one stack, there's a limit to how much our brains pay attention to the height of that stack. So if you give me $10 on top of $10, that's a big difference. Moving from 10 to 20 is a big difference.
Right.
Moving from 40 to 50 seems smaller psychologically. Moving from 120 to 130 is really a tiny difference. And so there's this tendency that some psychologists call it psychophysical numbing, is our brains become numb to increases in things. And so very often we can save the emotion by spreading it out into a process. And so Six Sigma quality, you may have heard of this in a business context, is some manufacturing organizations have made a Six Sigma quality for their process. And what that means is there are only 3.4 defects per million things. And so what would that mean in practical terms? Well, imagine baking 24 cookies a night, chocolate chip cookies, and every one comes out perfect. It's caramelized around the outside edges, it's soft in the middle, there's a bright number of chocolate chips there. And you do that for 24 cookies every night, and every cookie is flawless. And you do that for 37 years. That's Six Sigma quality. Not a single one with too many chips or too few chips in 37 years, not a single one that's burned or undercooked. And that's Six Sigma quality. And so converting to a process, if I told you 3.4 defects in a million, that just kind of blurs in your mind. But unpacking that in terms of what it means on a day-to-day basis and a year-to-year basis, then all of a sudden converting to a process helps you understand the magnitude of things that are otherwise hard to understand.
Yep, absolutely. By the way, I am, as many people are, kicking off the new year, making smart health decisions. Chocolate chip cookies are my favorite. That might have set me back a little bit. So thank you for that example. Last one, emotional measuring sticks.
Emotional measuring sticks are kind of what we were talking about with the Kaiser Permanente example. It's like,
Yep.
we know the size of emotion that we have when we think about breast cancer. It's an important disease. It's worth donating for. It's worth doing walks for. It's worth supporting breast cancer victims and encouraging them. And so if sepsis is bigger as a social issue than prostate cancer plus breast cancer combined, that's something we definitely ought to be doing as society. And my sense is that's something that the medical field is moving towards slowly, but it should be moving towards rapidly.
So as you said at the beginning of this, your kind of mission in life is you want to change the way people think and approach life and make the world a better place, for lack of a more descriptive way to describe, way to articulate this. All of your books seem to hit that nail on the head. For this book, what are you most excited about in terms of its impact on people and the community around us?
People talk about numbers a lot, and yet we're not understanding the numbers and what they're telling us. And there's wonder in the world, there is truth in the world that is only conveyed by numbers. And so if we had a society that was better able to bring numbers to bear and to talk about them and to compare them and act on them and be motivated by them, we'd live in a better place. And it would change our schools, it would change our business organizations, it would change society. And so what I hope is that if people start becoming more transparent about their numbers, people say you can lie with statistics. Well, yeah, you can lie with statistics, but it's a lot easier to lie without statistics. And so I'm a scientist. I believe that there is truth out there, and some things are more true than others. And so having a toolkit for making numbers transparent is going to lead to better decisions, and it's going to lead to more interesting world. I mean, the world is more interesting when you think of that frog jumping and you look at it and you say, boy, if people could jump like that, you could dunk from the opposite team's free throw line.
Right.
And that's an amazing observation, and it might make us think more carefully about trashing the wetlands that this frog is inhabiting. And so if we had a sense of the awe and wonder of the world, I think we would make a lot of decisions differently.
Well, I think to your point, just in this brief conversation, and I love numbers. I'm picturing my wife, who's a reading teacher for a long time. She's not drawn to numbers, but I think both of us with using, if our teachers or even if ourselves started using some of these principles, the emotion that's driven from these principles is amazing. And the fact that you get more interested, but also I feel like it gets me closer to action. And so that's the part that excites me about the potential of this book.
Yeah, I love that. I love that notion. I mean, I think most people think of numbers as dry and inert, and yet the numbers are what drives you to act. And if you see the numbers correctly.
So it seems kind of like, as I look at your career again from the outside, that, you and the people around you basically have a Midas touch of ideas that, turn into books that change lives. When you've had to create change in your life or attack change in your life, do you have kind of a system, or has there been some moments where, you've had to get outside your comfort zone? I'm just curious, like what tools or things you have in your life to help you attack change?
Yeah. I think the single most useful thing that I found in doing research on books for a number of years now is the concept of bright spots in the Switch book. And the notion of bright spots is that our brains are kind of wired to pay attention to problems. And so if we're having a global economic meltdown and our product isn't selling very well, we typically turn towards the bottom end of the distribution of salespeople, and we try to coach them and make them better and bring them up to speed. And what we don't do very often is look at the people that are still selling pretty well during a global economic downturn and shadowing them and figuring out what are they doing that's different. And I think that's definitely the way my mind works. Is my mind focuses on problems and tries to fix problems, as opposed to looking at what's working now and is a success and analyzing success. And so the same analytical skills that make you great at problem solving are going to make you great at solution scaling if you just turn your attention to the other end of the distribution. And so I do that constantly with myself. It's like I'll get frustrated that I've wasted a day on something that I shouldn't have, and yet in trying to fix that problem, I don't think about what are the characteristics of the days that I get work done, and can I analyze those and come up with routines and procedures that embody things that have been successful for me in a more formal way.
I would say that bright spot, as I told you before we started taping, the bright spot element was one of the things that really changed my life. Because too often, like even when you win, last night was, this podcast is gonna come out, later, but there's a big football game on, and if I were on the winning team, I'd probably celebrate for a little bit, but I'd be thinking about all the ways that we may have dropped the ball and how do we get better there. And so the bright spot for me, 10 years ago when I read it, or maybe a little bit longer now, was something that transformed the way I approach things. And so it's interesting to know that that's also impacted you personally. Are your books somewhat therapeutic that way for yourself? Like as you're diving into these issues, does some of it, feel like you dive in because you're so interested and you hope other folks are interested?
Yeah. I think what Dan and I have found, and what Carla and I found, is that we were talking about these things. Like when we were talking about math books, we got excited when we did the calculation about the frogs jumping, and we get excited when we did the calculation about the 2 quarters at the ends of the soccer field.
Right.
And so we write about what we think was impressive to us. And so that's the advantage of having a good co-author is you test out things on yourself, and if they work for you and they work for your co-author, that's a good sign that they're going to work for other people.
It's awesome. Have you, I was talking to a friend the other day who just is kind of stuck in a rut in life. And I would say that could be any of us. Have you ever found where you've struggled with kind of being in a rut of just like going through the motions? And if so, what kind of systems you have around you to help you break out of that? Or if you haven't, what kind of systems do you have in your life to keep you from those ruts? I
think what I've figured out is I can't get out of ruts without external feedback. And so what I would always do when I was a junior professor working on my research agenda is I would force myself to do 3 studies on a topic. And a typical paper would be like 5 studies and bound together with a common theme. But when I got to this research study point, I would take it on the road, and I would consciously phone up friends of mine that were in other universities in different parts of the country and ask if I could give a brown bag lunch talk, and this is something academics do for entertainment during the day, is they bring their lunch and listen to a scientific talk and make comments and ask questions and stuff. And so I would force myself to present it at least 7 or 8 times. And over time, it becomes clear what the right next study is, or what a different twist of framing the research package that would enable somebody else to understand it and use it, what that framing would be. And so I think when we get stuck with the rut, that would be the sign that I needed to go on the road and try it out with different audiences and see what kind of questions they had and what they got excited about. And that's impossible to do when you're by yourself. And technology today is even better because you don't even have to get on a plane to do it. You set up a situation like this and have a brown bag lunch with virtual crowd in 3 different cities if you wanted to.
That's awesome. So the series of questions that we ask everyone at the end of our time together are pretty simple. One is we're really fascinated with the habits and disciplines of successful people. And so do you have any daily or weekly habits that you think help set you up to be the most successful version of yourself?
I'm not a terribly habit executing person. And so I think what does keep me on track is the habit of, well, one of my advisors used to say, go where the terrain allows. And so if you're thinking about exploring an idea, exploring a field, there's some things that you can prove right now and some things that you can't. And so what's useful to me as a day-to-day habit is when I'm with a co-author, I try to get as much of my work done as possible and play ping pong with the other person. So I would work on a paper all night and send it to my co-author because I wanted them to wake up in the morning and see that we'd had analyses run and things that made progress on the paper. And so that notion of looking for what's a win for today and is really important to me. And so I want to know that I made material progress on the most important issue for the day. And when I do that, I can relax. And in fact, Teresa Mabile is a Harvard professor, has a brilliant book called The Progress Principle. And what she shows is that if you're predicting job satisfaction with people, it's not the benefits, it's not even the colleagues, it's not the interesting work. It's the fact that you are making progress on an issue that you care about on a day-to-day basis. And what managers ought to do is smooth the turf so that the team can make progress and remove the obstacles so that the team can feel that they made progress. And when you look at that progress principle view of the world, I think that's what keeps me, even though I don't have many routines and habits, that's a challenge, it's a threshold that I have to hit every day.
Well, I think that the answer I appreciate greatly, because I feel like there are some folks who are on the podcast who, have a quick answer of, it's about getting up early and getting quiet time or something late, but there are also other folks who may not think that way or driven that way, who again can be phenomenally successful. And so that's really refreshing to hear, is just a different take on that. My second question is, you've been an co-author of these really big New York Times bestselling books, life-changing books. What books have really made an impact on your life, or what podcasts are you listening to, or how are you consuming information that's making an influence or an impact on your life, either from the last 20 years or currently?
Yeah, I'm a huge Malcolm Gladwell fan. I've read everything that he's written, and I love his style of storytelling. And I'm also in awe of Michael Lewis for the same reason, because he can tell not only, I think when Gladwell tells a story, it's a 20-page story. When I tell a story, it's a 3-page story. I can only sustain it for so long. But when Malcolm Gladwell tells a story, it's a 20-page story. Michael Lewis writes a whole book on a really important issue and has beautiful scenes and characters, and it helps you understand high finance in a way that you never had understood before. And that's an incredible feat.
One question that we've had a lot of fun with the last few months is when, whether you're working out, walking around a neighborhood, driving in your car, music or listening to something, whether it's music or not, seems to be a part of everyone's life or many people's lives. I'm just curious, when you're either driving around or doing one of those activities, what is on your playlist or what are you listening to?
I listen to a lot of alternative rock. So The National is my current favorite group. And I confess that I've been doing a retro thing recently. And I have excuse for this. I have an older daughter who's 18, and she's better at naming 70s songs than I am.
Wow.
And so I listened to a lot of Elton John from my earlier life and celebrate that because my daughter is actually listening to the same stuff.
That's awesome. All right, last question, because we know we've got to wrap up here so you can get back to the number of other activities that you have. What is the best piece of, either leadership advice or self-improvement advice that is on your mind or something you've come across recently that's really made an impact on you?
I think I would go back to that phrase, and it came from my academic advisor as a graduate student named Amos Tversky. And he's become known as one of the founders of behavioral economics. He was a psychologist that was doing work that was so transformative of the way that we view how humans make decisions that it affected the economics profession as a whole. Unfortunately, he died before he could share the Nobel Prize with his co-author, Danny Kahneman. But Amos used to say, go where the train allows. And what he meant was there are all these big ideas that we would like to tackle, that he wanted to tackle about human decision-making processes. And there are some things that you knew that you couldn't prove yet. And so it's easy for graduate students, especially, to bog down in existential depression because they have these big thoughts and they're not able to show the big thoughts and capture them in dissertation in the way that they wanted to. What Tversky would say is, go where the train allows, make progress that day. If you know an experiment that needs to be run the experiment. And if you don't know how to analyze the data, well, phone somebody up and ask them, how do you analyze this data? And so going where the train allows is a commitment to making forward progress in whatever way you can, with the idea that there is a bigger picture there. And you may know things that you're not able to prove yet, but if the train continues to evolve and open up, you're gonna get there eventually.
That's great. Well, this has been an awesome 15 minutes. I mean, you're someone I have only dreamed of getting to talk to one day, as of 10 years ago when I first got exposed to your work in a real way. I can't thank you enough for just the work that you've done in terms of co-authoring books, but also your time here, sharing your head and your heart with us. It's been a huge blessing, and I'm excited to read your new book. When is it out? Do you know?
It's out today.
It's out today?
We were talking, yeah.
I signed up for the pre-order, but I wasn't sure when I was going to be able to pick it up. So today, that's awesome.
So I hope you enjoy it.
I absolutely will. And I will actually reach out to you after I read it and let you know how it's impacted my life. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your courage to go out and share your ideas with the world, to let them, I think I would say you're making a massive impact in so many lives, but I'm sure sometimes as an author, you can only focus on the critiques. So I just want to encourage you to continue to do what you do and keep sharing your thoughts with the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
Please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, podcast on Apple or Spotify, and help us celebrate the beautiful, messy work of shaping human potential.